Marilyn Bennett stepped into the small, dimly lit courtroom, the smell of aged wood and paper hanging in the air. She adjusted her glasses, smoothing out the hem of her coat as she took a seat in the back row. The court was nearly empty, save for a few families, and a handful of lawyers sitting at their desks. The buzz of soft conversation stopped when the bailiff called the case. State of Town versus Marilyn Bennett. Judge Thomas Grant, seated behind a large wooden bench, barely looked up as he adjusted his glasses. His face was set in a permanent frown, a reflection of his strict, by-the-book attitude. To him, this was just another minor traffic violation to process. He didn't need to know who this woman was, or what was going on outside of this courtroom. Marilyn Bennett had been caught speeding. That was all that mattered. The judge called her name with a dismissive tone, his voice echoing in the silence. Marilyn stood, smooth and composed, as the eyes of the room shifted toward her. She didn't flinch, didn't stumble. This was just another part of her day, though she didn't let her calm demeanor fool anyone. She was well aware that, in this moment, she was a black woman standing before a white judge in a small, conservative town. The expectations were clear. Be polite. Don't draw attention. And just get through it. The judge, scanning the paperwork in front of him, barely acknowledged her as he began to speak. Ms. Bennett, you were caught speeding on Route 9 yesterday. You've been fined for the violation, but I've decided to reduce the fine to $150. This will be your one warning. Any future infractions will not be dealt with so leniently. Marilyn nodded politely, accepting the decision without comment. There was no point in arguing. She had been speeding, after all, and the fine, though irritating, wasn't a life-altering event. The judge continued, issuing a quick reminder to all in the courtroom about the importance of following the law. His words felt more like an afterthought, directed at the room rather than her specifically. As the judge moved on to the next case, Marilyn felt a small wave of relief. The whole ordeal had lasted less than 10 minutes, and it was over. She was ready to leave, but as she gathered her things, the weight of the room's assumptions hung in the air. No one knew who she was. No one in this small town had any clue that Marilyn Bennett wasn't just another local resident. She was leading a federal initiative to bring broadband access to rural communities across the country. She was an architect of change, working on a project that would impact millions. But here, in this courtroom, she was just another driver with a speeding ticket. It didn't matter. Not today. Marilyn Bennett walked out of the courtroom, the heavy wooden door closing quietly behind her. The crisp autumn air greeted her as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the town's quiet streets stretching out ahead. It was a stark contrast to her life back in Washington, D.C., where she was surrounded by constant movement, busy offices, and high-stakes meetings. But here, in this small town, everything felt slower, quieter, almost out of place. Yet it was this pace that gave Marilyn a chance to reflect. While she had just been handed a simple speeding ticket, the reality of her life extended far beyond what anyone in this town could imagine. Marilyn wasn't just a regular citizen. She was a driving force behind a groundbreaking initiative. Her role as the lead coordinator of a federal broadband project was a responsibility she carried with pride. The initiative was part of a nationwide effort designed to bring high-speed internet to rural and underserved urban communities. It was about more than just connecting people to the web. It was about connecting them to opportunities in education, healthcare, and employment. Marilyn's job had been far from easy. She worked with lawmakers, tech companies, and local governments, forging partnerships that could make the vision of equal internet access a reality. She'd spent countless hours researching, strategizing, and negotiating, work that often went unnoticed by the general public. Her mission wasn't glamorous, but the impact was immeasurable. The initiative had already begun in several states, helping schools deliver lessons remotely, enabling telehealth services for people who lived miles away from doctors, and allowing businesses to grow by reaching customers they never could have before. Yet, despite the scale of the project, most people didn't know her name. Marilyn preferred it that way. The work, she believed, was more important than any recognition she could receive. As she drove back to her temporary residence in the town, her mind wandered back to the courtroom. She had been calm, collected, just another woman in a professional setting. But she couldn't help but wonder. Did the judge even know who she was? Did he realize that the small fine he had issued would mean so little compared to the work she was doing to reshape the lives of millions of people across the country? Back at her hotel, Marilyn unpacked her bag and opened her laptop. The work didn't stop. As the Broadband initiative moved forward, there were still meetings to attend, data to analyze, and partners to engage. For Marilyn, it was a never-ending cycle, but it was one she was willing to embrace. In a way, the quiet moments, like the one she had just experienced in court, gave her space to reflect on the bigger picture, to understand just how crucial the work was, and how, for many, the internet would soon become a lifeline. The small town's gossip mill churned into overdrive when the local newspaper, the Town Gazette, published a story about Marilyn Bennett. The reporter, a young woman named Jenna Michaels, had been doing routine background checks on the court cases for the day's edition when she stumbled upon something unusual. Jenna's curiosity piqued when she found that the woman who had appeared before Judge Grant was not just another resident. Marilyn Bennett had a significant role in the federal government. It didn't take long for Jenna to dig deeper. Marilyn's name appeared in multiple government reports and articles detailing her leadership in the federal broadband initiative that was sweeping across the country. The project, intended to provide high-speed internet to rural and underserved urban areas, was something people in Washington had been talking about for months. But here, in this town, no one seemed to know about it. Jenna's article ran the following morning, and it was the talk of the town by noon. The headline read, "Local Woman Fined in Court, What You Don't Know About Marilyn Bennett." The story detailed not only Marilyn's speeding violation, but also revealed her high-profile position as a key player in the initiative. The article described how the federal program was designed to bring internet access to millions of people in small towns and rural areas, places that, until recently, had been left behind in the digital age. As the story circulated, the townspeople began to reassess their view of Marilyn. The woman they had seen only as a quiet, well-dressed figure now took on a different dimension. Some were surprised, others were in awe. The small-town atmosphere, where news spread quickly and judgment often followed closely behind, suddenly became filled with questions. How had Marilyn's groundbreaking work remained a secret? Why hadn't she shared her involvement in such an important project? In the coffee shop, where regulars gathered every morning to gossip about everything from town politics to local sports, the story became the focal point of conversation. One man, Steve Harris, leaned over the counter, his mug in hand. "I can't believe it. This whole time, I thought she was just a businesswoman or something. Never knew she was tied up in something so big," he remarked, shaking his head. Others around him nodded in agreement. "She could have said something," one woman murmured. "Imagine what that kind of initiative could do for this town." Marilyn had always kept her work separate from her personal life, believing that the impact of the program would speak louder than her individual story. But now, her role had become public knowledge. People started to see her as more than just a local woman with a speeding ticket. They saw her as a leader, a connector of people to opportunities they had long been denied. As the news of Marilyn's involvement spread, the dynamic of the town began to shift. Some people were proud to claim her as one of their own, while others questioned why someone with so much power had been so quiet about it. The fine, once just a minor inconvenience, now seemed almost trivial in comparison to the larger story unfolding around Marilyn Bennett. Judge Thomas Grant sat in his office, his mind racing. It had been 2 days since the Gazette article had landed on his desk, and he couldn't stop thinking about Marilyn Bennett. He had seen the name in the courtroom, but hadn't thought much of it. He'd been too quick to issue that fine, too focused on the mundane details of the case. Speeding violations were routine for him, a part of the daily grind. But now, after reading that article, everything had changed. He hadn't realized who he'd been dealing with. A woman who wasn't just a local resident, but a key figure in a federal initiative that could transform the lives of countless people. The more he thought about it, the more his discomfort grew. He had been so focused on enforcing the law, on maintaining order, that he hadn't bothered to dig deeper. He hadn't bothered to ask who the person standing before him really was. Grant wasn't the type to question his decisions often, but this felt different. He had made judgments based on assumptions, and in this case, those assumptions had been wrong. Marilyn Bennett wasn't just some anonymous driver. She was a leader, a changemaker, quietly doing work that affected millions of lives. His guilt was compounded by the thought that perhaps he had judged her based on the color of her skin, the way she carried herself. He had seen her as just another minor case to get through, not a woman with a vision that could impact the nation. It gnawed at him, making him restless during the long hours in his office. The judge spent the next few days avoiding the papers, but the guilt wouldn't go away. He found himself revisiting the courtroom, replaying every moment of Marilyn's hearing in his head. He had spoken to her briefly, barely looked at her. She was calm, almost distant, not the usual nervous defendant who would beg for leniency. But now he realized that her composure had likely come from the confidence of knowing she had nothing to fear from him. She had been in far more important meetings than this one. The more he thought about it, the more he knew he needed to do something. He wasn't sure what, but he couldn't let the mistake sit there, unanswered. A part of him wanted to reach out to Marilyn, to apologize for his oversight, but another part wondered if it would come across as condescending or worse, patronizing. Still, the weight of his actions was heavy, and he knew he couldn't ignore it. He made up his mind. He needed to speak to Marilyn Bennett, not as a judge, but as a person who had failed to see her for who she truly was. He just hoped she would be willing to listen. As the days passed, Marilyn continued her work, unaffected by the growing attention. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the recognition. Rather, she was used to doing things quietly, without fanfare. She had always believed that the work itself was what mattered most, not the person doing it. And so, even as her name circulated through town and beyond, she remained focused on the mission that had brought her to this point, the federal broadband initiative. Her days were filled with back-to-back meetings with government officials, tech companies, and community leaders, all working toward the same goal, to bring high-speed internet to underserved areas. While the spotlight now hovered over her, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. This wasn't about her. It was about the millions of people whose lives could be improved by access to the digital world. Whether it was a student able to take an online class, a farmer reaching new markets, or a family gaining access to healthcare through telemedicine, Marilyn knew the initiative was changing lives. But the work was far from easy. There were constant hurdles to overcome, delays, funding challenges, and, of course, skepticism from those who had lived without reliable internet for years. Marilyn often found herself caught between worlds. In Washington, she was a well-respected leader, someone who had earned her position through years of hard work and sacrifice. But in small towns like this one, she was still just a woman with a speeding ticket. She hadn't sought out the attention, but now that it had found her, she had no intention of letting it distract her from what was important. One morning, as she sat in her hotel room, reviewing reports, she received a message that made her pause. It was from an old colleague, someone who worked closely with her on the broadband initiative. The message was simple: "You've been making a real difference. Don't let the noise get to you." Her colleague was right. Despite the rumors and the increased attention, the mission had to remain her focus. In a world where distractions were constant, Marilyn had learned to tune them out. The work was the anchor that kept her grounded. The next day, after hours of meetings and conference calls, Marilyn walked through the quiet streets of the town, her mind still on the project. It had been a long day, but she felt the familiar sense of fulfillment that came from knowing her efforts were part of something much larger than herself. As she passed the courthouse, the memory of the fine lingered briefly, but it was quickly replaced by the realization that it no longer mattered. What mattered was the change she was helping to create, one connection at a time. It wasn't about recognition. It was about the lives that were being transformed by the very work most people still didn't even know she was leading. A few days after the story about Maryland's federal broadband initiative had gone viral in town, Judge Thomas Grant found himself sitting alone in his office, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee on his desk. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about her, about how he had treated her so flippantly, assuming that her case was just another minor infraction, when in reality, she was leading a monumental effort to change the lives of millions of people. The guilt had settled deep within him, and as the days wore on, it grew more unbearable. He had acted too quickly, not only as a judge but also as a man influenced by his own biases. In that brief moment in court, he had failed to see the person standing before him. Marilyn was more than just a driver with a speeding ticket. She was a powerhouse, someone whose work touched the future of an entire nation. Grant knew he had to make things right, but he wasn't sure how to approach her. His usual approach, dictating from behind a bench, didn't seem to fit the situation. He thought about what he could say. An apology was in order, of course, but words could never truly undo the discomfort he had caused. Still, if there was one thing Grant understood, it was the power of owning up to mistakes, no matter how difficult it was. After much deliberation, he picked up the phone. He dialed Marilyn's number, feeling his heart race as it rang. The line clicked, and Marilyn's calm voice answered. "Hello, this is Marilyn Bennett." "Ms. Bennett, this is Judge Grant," he said, his voice more hesitant than he expected. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Marilyn paused for a moment, a brief silence hanging between them. "No, not at all. How can I help you, Judge?" There was a weight in his chest, but he pressed on. "I wanted to personally apologize for how I handled your case. I was too quick to judge you, and I didn't take the time to understand who you were or what you were doing. I made an assumption based on the circumstances of your ticket, and I deeply regret that." Marilyn's response was measured, but there was a warmth to it. "Thank you for reaching out, Judge. I appreciate your honesty. It's easy to make snap judgments, especially in situations like that. But I believe it's important to remember that everyone has a story. Sometimes, we just don't see it." Grant felt a wave of relief wash over him, but also a sense of admiration. She wasn't angry or defensive, just calm, composed and understanding, as if she'd expected this conversation all along. "I'll be the first to admit I didn't see your story," he said quietly. "But I do now. And I want you to know that I respect what you're doing. The work you're leading is important, and I wish I'd known that when you walked into my courtroom." Marilyn's voice softened. "It's not about recognition, Judge. It's about the people we serve. But I appreciate your words. They mean a lot." The conversation ended on a quiet note, but the air between them had shifted. For Judge Grant, this was more than just an apology. It was a moment of growth. For Marilyn, it was another step in her journey, one that proved even the most unexpected moments could lead to change. The days following Judge Grant's apology were filled with a quiet sense of relief for Marilyn. She didn't expect an apology from him. She had never sought one. But there was something powerful about his willingness to admit his mistake. It wasn't about him trying to erase what had happened in court, but about a shift in perspective, one that acknowledged the deeper work she was involved in. It was a humbling experience, especially in a world where people often preferred to hide their flaws rather than confront them. For Judge Grant, the apology had marked the beginning of a personal journey. He felt compelled to take it further, beyond just making amends with Marilyn. He had seen how quickly assumptions were made about her, not just by him, but by others in the town who had only known her by face, not by the full scope of her accomplishments. His realization wasn't just about understanding Marilyn's role in the broadband initiative. It was about recognizing the broader truth that people, especially those who were often overlooked or underestimated, were capable of extraordinary things. Judge Grant knew he couldn't change the past, but he could try to make a difference in the present. Over the next few weeks, he began speaking more openly about the importance of digital equity and broadband access, topics that had previously been outside his usual realm of concern. At town meetings, he found himself advocating for the very cause Marilyn had been working on all along. He spoke about how high-speed internet was no longer just a luxury, but a necessity for people to succeed in the modern world. He spoke with an urgency he hadn't felt before, driven by his newfound understanding of the impact of inequality in access to technology. Marilyn, on her part, continued with her work, quietly but diligently. She had always known the work was bigger than herself. But now, with the newfound support of Judge Grant and others in the town, she found herself more optimistic about the future. His shift in perspective didn't just help her, it also helped the community understand the importance of the work being done, and why it was essential for everyone to be included in the digital age. The town itself started to change too. At first, people were hesitant to fully embrace the idea of a federal broadband initiative. Many were skeptical of the government's ability to bring real change. But as they saw the impact of the work Marilyn had been part of, and as Judge Grant continued to speak about its importance, those doubts began to fade. Marilyn began attending community forums and talking to local leaders about the benefits of broadband access. She was no longer just the woman with the speeding ticket. She was a recognized leader who had a genuine interest in the community's well-being. Judge Grant, once a distant authority figure, was now an ally, and together, they were working to rebuild trust, not just in the town's institutions, but in each other. The most significant change wasn't just in the relationship between Marilyn and the judge. It was in the way the town began to see its own potential for growth, its ability to rise above assumptions, and its willingness to embrace the future. Marilyn's quiet strength had ignited something far bigger than a simple apology. It had sparked a transformation. Several months had passed since the courtroom incident and the subsequent shift in the town's perspective. Marilyn Bennett had become a well-known figure, not just in the town, but in the surrounding communities as well. Her work with the Federal Broadband Initiative was making tangible progress. Schools were now connecting students to remote learning opportunities. Doctors were able to provide telehealth services to rural families, and businesses that once struggled to reach customers were now expanding their reach. People were beginning to see the benefits of high-speed internet, and with that, they were beginning to understand just how essential it was to the community's future. Judge Grant, too, had changed. He was more engaged in community events, advocating for the need for broadband access, and encouraging local government leaders to back initiatives that would bridge the digital divide. His newfound appreciation for the work Marilyn was doing was evident in everything he said. It wasn't just a matter of legal responsibility, it was a personal mission now. He often spoke about the need for equal access to technology, emphasizing that no community should be left behind simply because it lacked the infrastructure to thrive in the digital world. One evening, at a town hall meeting, Marilyn stood alongside Judge Grant, both of them speaking before a room full of local residents and officials. It had been a year since the initial article ran, and in that time, the town had seen a transformation. People who had once been skeptical about the broadband project now saw its value. Businesses were flourishing, children were thriving in online classrooms, and elderly residents were accessing medical care remotely. It wasn't perfect, but the progress was undeniable. Marilyn addressed the crowd, her calm voice filled with purpose. What we've accomplished together is not just about connecting wires and signals. It's about connecting people to opportunities. It's about making sure no one is left out in a world that is increasingly digital. Our work is far from done, but we are moving in the right direction. She paused, looking around the room at the faces that had once been uncertain. And it all starts with understanding. Understanding that every person, no matter where they live, deserves access to the tools they need to succeed. As she finished speaking, the crowd erupted into applause. Judge Grant, who had been sitting at the front, stood and clapped as well. He caught her eye across the room, offering a nod of respect and gratitude. Marilyn smiled back, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. In that moment, there was a sense of shared accomplishment, not just in the success of the project, but in the way they had both grown. The town was no longer just a place with a story about a speeding ticket. It had become a place where people were empowered, connected, and ready for the future. Marilyn had brought more than just broadband. She had brought hope. And in the process, she had also sparked change in the hearts of people who were willing to listen and, more importantly, to learn. Marilyn's legacy wasn't defined by her position or title. It was defined by the connections she helped build, both in the digital world and in the hearts of those who had once judged her by a single moment in time.